In the years between the two world wars, while Europe watched the rise of the fascist empire, another empire was expanding its sphere of influence. The Soviet Union claimed to stand for liberation. It spoke the language of revolution, anti-imperialism, and equality among nations. But across Asia in the late 1920s and 1930s, Soviet imperialism advanced not through consent but through force, covert intervention, political manipulation, and outright military action, ignoring sovereignty. From Manchuria to Xinjiang and Afghanistan, Moscow unceremoniously interfered in the internal affairs of neighboring countries, ignoring international law and extending influence deep into the heart of Asia. It was endless Soviet expansionism, fueled by imperialism, modified by the Bolsheviks. At the turn of the 20th century, the Russian Empire carved a steel corridor through northeastern China. Between 1897 and 1902, the Chinese Eastern Railway was constructed, linking the Russian cities of Chita and Vladivostok through the Chinese region of Manchuria. The railway was more than transportation. It was imperial leverage. Control over Manchuria meant influence over all of northern China. After the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, the new Soviet government attempted to present itself as fundamentally different from the old Russian Empire. In July 1919, Soviet diplomat Lev Karakon issued a manifesto promising that the Soviet government would return the Chinese Eastern Railway to China, free of charge. To Chinese nationalists, it sounded breathtaking. To many around the world, it appeared the Soviet Union was rejecting imperialism entirely. But the promise would not survive reality. Once the Bolsheviks secured victory in the Russian Civil War in 1922, their priorities changed. The Soviet Union quietly abandoned the Karakon Manifesto. Instead of handing over the railway, Moscow negotiated joint management with the Republic of China in 1924. But in Manchuria, the powerful warlord Jiang Zuiliang refused to accept Soviet influence over the railway crossing his territory. Tensions escalated rapidly. In the summer of 1929, Jiang's forces stormed railway offices and arrested Soviet personnel, including the railway's Soviet director. The Kremlin answered with force. In August 1929, the Soviet Union formed the Special Far Eastern Army under Marshal Vasily Blusha. Its mission was simple, to restore Soviet control over the Chinese Eastern Railway. The Red Army launched coordinated river assaults, mechanized offensives, and aerial operations that overwhelmed Chinese forces. The Soviet military proved vastly more organized and better equipped. By December 1929, China was forced to sign the Khabarovsk Protocol, restoring Soviet rights over the railway. But victory came with a darker consequence. Thousands of ethnic Chinese living in Soviet cities such as Irkutsk, Chita, and Ulan-Ude were arrested and deported. The message was unmistakable: resistance to the Soviet Empire would be crushed, militarily, politically, and ethnically. To the west of Manchuria lay Xinjiang province, the vast frontier region bordering the Soviet Union. Ethnically and religiously diverse, deeply unstable, and strategically priceless. In the early 1930s, Xinjiang descended into chaos. In February 1931, the Kumul rebellion erupted against the ruling Xinjiang military clique. The uprising was fueled by discrimination against Muslim Turkic peoples, particularly Uyghurs. The immediate spark came from the annexation of the semi-autonomous Kumul Khanate by the Xinjiang military clique. Soon, rebels allied with the Muslim warlord Maz Hongying and Hui Muslim forces, supported by the Kuomintang government. The province spiraled toward civil war. In 1933, a coup brought pro-Soviet General Chiang Shikai to power. The Kumul rebellion threatened Chiang Shikai's power, so he turned to Moscow for survival. The Soviet Union responded immediately. Communist International operative and intelligence officer Grigorij Prezov arrived in Xinjiang as Soviet Consul General. Officially, he was a diplomat. In reality, he became one of Moscow's chief coordinators in the region. By late 1933, rebel forces were closing in on Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang province. During the Second Battle of Urumqi, which began in December 1933, the Xinjiang military clique's forces were on the verge of being routed by the United Rebel Army. Chiang Kai-shek's regime stood on the brink of destruction. However, thanks to Prezov's efforts, the Soviet invasion of Xinjiang began. In January 1934, approximately 7,000 Soviet troops crossed into Xinjiang. They wore uniforms without insignia. The invasion was carried out in secrecy, and it could be denied. The force included tanks, artillery, aircraft, and soldiers of the Soviet State Political Directorate, supported by white Russian émigrés who had once fought against the Bolsheviks. Together with Chiang Kai-shek's forces, the Soviets forced the rebel army to retreat. The Xinjiang military clique and Chiang Kai retained power. But its independence did not. The province effectively became a Soviet protectorate. In 1937, another uprising erupted among Uyghur Muslims. Once again, Chiang Kai appealed to Moscow. And again, thousands of Red Army troops entered Xinjiang, supported by armor and aircraft. The rebellion was destroyed. Then came the purge. Inspired by Stalin's Great Purge inside the Soviet Union, Chiang Kai unleashed mass repression across Xinjiang. The Soviet People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, Russian abbreviation is NKVD, assisted directly. Uyghur and Hui political elites were targeted. Arrests, executions, disappearances. Entire communities were shattered. Historians estimate that between 50,000 and 100,000 Uyghurs and Hui Muslims perished. Xinjiang had not only been influenced by Moscow but also terrorized and inspired by its Great Purge. After the beginning of the Sovietization of former Russian Turkestan, strong pressure from the superior forces of the Red Army forced the anti-Soviet Muslim guerrillas, known as the Basmachi, to retreat into northern Afghanistan. There, they regrouped. And from there, they continued to threaten Soviet Central Asia. Moscow decided that this threat was unacceptable. In 1929, Afghanistan descended into civil war. King Amanullah Khan lost control of much of the country. The Soviet Union saw an opportunity. In mid-April 1929, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan. The operation was commanded by Soviet officer Vitaly Primakov. To conceal Moscow's involvement, Soviet soldiers wore Afghan uniforms. Soviet aircraft provided air support. The invasion force captured several cities in northern Afghanistan. But international reaction was swift. Across Europe, Turkey, and Iran, reports of Soviet troops inside Afghanistan triggered alarm. The intervention was condemned as aggression. Facing diplomatic backlash and with Amanullah fleeing into exile in India, Moscow withdrew its forces in June 1929. Officially, the Soviet Union denied responsibility. Unofficially, the message had already been delivered. The Kremlin was willing to cross borders and violate any country's sovereignty to expand its influence. The following year, Soviet forces returned. In June 1930, a Soviet cavalry brigade under Commander Yakov Melkumov crossed deep into Afghan territory. Its mission was to destroy Basmachi bases and eliminate resistance networks. But the Basmachi had been warned. They retreated into the mountains before Soviet troops arrived. Unable to force a decisive battle, Soviet forces burned villages and seized livestock. The operation produced no major military victory. Yet it demonstrated a growing Soviet imperial doctrine, cross-border military intervention, in disregard of sovereignty. By the late 1930s, Soviet control stretched across vast regions of Asia. In Manchuria, Moscow enforced its claims through military power. In Xinjiang, Soviet military intervention transformed the Chinese province into a dependent client regime. In Afghanistan, covert invasions revealed the Kremlin's willingness to wage undeclared war beyond its borders. These operations were rarely carried out openly. Some were disguised. Others denied entirely. But together, they formed a pattern: the expansion of Soviet spheres of influence through military intervention, lies, political manipulation, and strategic domination. Long before the Russo-Ukrainian War divided the world, the Kremlin was already testing the boundaries of sovereignty.